Okay, members and friends, this little puppy, Mom of Andre was saying that this is his favorite puppy. So, I didn't know that. We found it just over there in a basket, right? But anyway, I don't know what I'm going to call this one. Maybe, what's the bonus that these people get for doing what they do. Made a few phone calls today, talked to a few people, learned a few things, kind of discovered that, this is again, a systemic problem. Who's that?
Me.
And it's not ready yet.
Not even a potato? I just want a potato. Are you filming? Sorry.
That was my youngest son, 22, in college. I never lost any of my kids, so this is a new experience for me to lose my grandson. Today, myself and my stepfather, which would be a great granddaddy to, my grandson, we opened up a trust account for him. And it's just a basic one for now until we talk to the lawyer. And then we'll decide from there how we want to proceed with it, because there's another step up that we can, build in as we go along. So trust fund has been opened, and I guess I'll be learning how to do online banking and all these things I don't know how to do. And I borrowed some money on my life insurance, so that will help to pay for the retainer anyway. And we'll, depending on what happens, we'll either need to fundraise to pay for the lawyer or quote-unquote lawyers, depending on what's going on. And because, the lawyer needs time to think about this, and I have one now. So I'm going to trust that, he's going to think about this, right? And analyze what the situation is really, occurring. But in terms of legislation and, from my understanding, I was told that on a provincial level, this is not created through legislation through the BC Parliament Legislative Assemblies, which is the Parliament House in Victoria, right? It's a different kind of section. They got their own books, and, they have their own laws and their own rules and their own this and their own mandate. Although I would think that, somewhere through the Parliament House, these laws are tweaked. And, doing some reading on the internet, apparently there's some new laws coming up in March, which are quite elusive in terms of, not being in the best interest of children, from what I read. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I don't interpret language, so I'm just taking it from the top of my head from what I was reading quickly, and I'm like, okay, so they're making it harder. And as I said, I talked to a few other people on the phone today, and, it has been noted that in Surrey there does seem to be a problem with children at a particular age being apprehended for the purpose of adoption. And I'm like, oh my God, what are you saying? Well, just the way the actions are being carried on right now, they could very well be trying to get them up for adoption within a year. Which, I can't even fathom that idea, because it doesn't make any sense. I raised 5 of my own children, had no interactions with social services from the birth on. 4 of them, basically lived at home until they kicked out my daughter, right? And, I looked after a little girl for 3.5 years. I do community stuff with children. And for some reason, they're intent to adopt them out. Or apprehend them with maybe the purpose to. I mean, I don't know what their true intentions are. But their actions are speaking louder than words, right? And based on the few people that I spoke to today, they've seen this kind of action before. And just with the numbers of children being apprehended up in the district, in this area where I live, you know, you kind of put two and two together and you start to see a pattern. My grandson is 28 months. He's now starting to forget about us. If they would have taken him when he was 3.5, even 3, you know, 3.5, 4, he wouldn't have been able to, you know, mold into that, you know, that monkey baby, right? You know, they want them when they're young, right? Like I said, they wanted him when he was born. That's why they wanted my daughter out of the house, so they would have came back into my house and said, no, something wrong, you know, and can't leave him here, and, you know, we're going to put him over there, and, you know, you can try, but, you know, you're never going to live up. But you know, my daughter made the right choice, and she stayed home, and she did the best that she could, and she, you know, most 90% of the time, 99% of the time, she was, you know, she did really well. I have videos, pictures to prove that. I don't need to prove anything. What is really throwing her for a loop, though, is being thrown out into the streets with absolutely zero resources, and then just spiraling down as the game playing and the miscommunication and the trickery was, you know, implanted so that, you know, that wedge could go between me and my grandchild as they were, you know, in the background making plans to remove him from the whole family. They just didn't remove him from my daughter. They removed him from the whole family. A 15-year-old, a 17-year-old, a 22-year-old. Obviously, my daughter is 26. And then, you know, there's my dad who's like 74. So this is his first grandbaby. And then his wife, who she herself couldn't have kids, and she ended up adopting a child, right? That, you know, their relationship is, you know. So that was her first grandbaby. You know, her first time she got to hold a baby since she adopted her baby, you know, 35 years ago or 40 years ago. I think her adopted daughter is 40 or something. So the last time she held a baby was 40 years ago, you know. Last time my dad held a baby was when my youngest was a baby, and she's 15 now. So that was 15 years ago. So they're not just taking the baby away from the mom. They're taking away from, you know, my dad, my children, 3 of them here in the house. 4 is the mother, that's 5. You can throw in the Auntie Joan, that's 6. And then me, I'm 7. You know, 2 people sat up there and destroyed 8 lives if you count Andre. Because they have a mission to build on their bonus or something. I mean, I realize that politics plays a role in the fact that, you know, if you got a high number of drug addicts out in this area and you've got an X number of babies, you know, coming through the system, and maybe you might have to make a projection in terms of, well, we need this many foster homes, you know, we need this many adopting homes. And but we also know that, you know, a large majority of children that go in within the adoption system don't get adopted out because they end up becoming too old, or they have, you know, severe psychological problems, or, you know, some have physical disabilities. You know, now my grandson was smart, right? And he was mild. Not to say he couldn't have a little temper on him, but he is a pleasant little boy. And polite. Very polite, you know, and wanting to learn. And his mom used to do ABCs with him, and 1, 2, 3, and, you know, Auntie played piano with him and sang, you know, and they just wiping that all out so that, because he would be easy to adopt compared to maybe, you know, 20 other children that they have in the system that, you know, they're just going to push along. So again, they're scouring to fill that quota, because they want that funding from the provincial government, so, you know, they can say, well, you know, we got 3,000 kids going into the foster care system, you know, we need X amount of dollars to keep our offices open, right? But then at the same time, they're also fueling it by kicking out the mothers, you know, providing absolutely no resources, disenfranchising whole families, you know, singling out the one that, you know, me, right? Trying to single me out because, you know, it's like the kids, eh? Oh, it's mom's fault. You know, she likes to keep things around the house, or, you know, she didn't take me to my appointment, or it's always mom's fault. Well, they're trying to blame me for this too. They're like kids trying to blame the mom. You know, only they got the backing of a government that's obviously not paying attention and allowing it to happen. So who's at fault? What's the title of this? I don't know. Who's at fault? Is it the government, the provincial government, that allows these workers to go in there and cherry pick, vulnerable children and exercise and a massive amount of, power that really nobody should have, so that they can, dicker around, wait for the year to go by, and then, adopt them off to some family that has no relation to him after they've psychologically severely damaged him. And then, by the time he's in grade 5, or I'm sorry, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, by that time he'll probably develop a learning disability because he was forced to learn too quickly. And plus he was learning under stress, due stress, with all the stress that they're causing him. So now all of a sudden, the school system benefits because they get to put we've got this extra special needs child, so we need this extra funding from the government to compensate for this child that they helped to create to have a learning disability. My grandson has already had way too many hurdles put in front of him for the simple fact that his mother was an addict before she got pregnant, and she struggled with addiction while pregnant. Yes, there was a lull when she stopped, and yes, she, recovered to, a large degree, in the last 28 months. Her mood swings weren't always, the easiest to live with, but she wasn't a junkie, she wasn't a heroin addict, and she certainly wasn't doing what she's doing now at the provocative, at being provoked through social services and their actions, right? And he's paying the price for this, because they're just, carting him around, putting him in strange environments with strange people, mishandling him. He had, not this last week, but the week before when my daughter seen him, she said his whole back was all bumpy and rough, and he had little bumps all over him, right? This week he was dehydrated. His eyes were extremely sad. He wasn't calling out for us that much because, we're not there. And if we go and see him, and then he wants to come, it benefits in their favor because he learns to get angry with us. That's why his mom is having a hard time seeing him right now, because she doesn't want him to get angry because they were so close. Like they are, it's like Frankenstein. They're creating, they've chopped them up into little pieces, and they're going to sew them back up. And they're going to hope that they're going to get something that they can market out to some family that can't produce children, because maybe that woman has a psychological cuckoo, like my dad's wife. How come she fell through the system? How come nobody came in there and took her kid away? She went to mental institutions. She had shock therapy. She had 40 years of a psychiatrist. She took all kinds of prescription pills, but nobody went in there and took her baby away. She was allowed to keep her baby because she adopted the baby. Why did she not have it taken away the first time she went into a mental institution? Because she went in like 3-4 times. It's not just a one-time thing that she went in with, right? Was it because she worked for the government and she was protected by the union and she had a husband that, carried the brunt of the load so that it could be, hidden away? And, is that what's going to happen to my grandson? Is he going to end up in some family that, the wife could be little cuckoo, and, and dad, the husband will mask it so that, the wife can go in and out at mental institutions, and, she can do all kinds of strange, be bulimic and anorexic and take prescription pills that are coming out of her yin yang, and, spending millions of dollars on psychiatrists? Is that how my grandson's going to grow up? With that kind of an adoptive family? Because that's the kind of family that my dad's wife provided for her adopted child. So you can't sell adoption on me, other than it's baby brokering, and they're picking on the poorest of the poor, and they're cherry picking. Now I have a lawyer now, okay? And I'm going to trust that my lawyer is going to give me good advice and really help the family, because he's not just my lawyer. He's Andre's lawyer, really. He's Andre's lawyer. I opened up a trust account today for Andre, for lawyers. Plural, more than one. if the lawyer feels he needs a partner, we'll fundraise and we'll get him a partner, right? 2 voices is better than 1 sometimes. And my voice is just in the wilderness. I told him about my channel. He has a gist of what's going on. Obviously he's a busy man. It's going to take him some time to figure it out, right? He's got other clients and other cases to deal with. He can't sit there and listen to my videos, right, for long periods of time. But I said, well, when you have some time, have a coffee and just listen. If anything, just listen. I'm heartbroken. I'm very scared for my grandson. I've never lost any of my kids. I don't understand this other than the politics around it and the corruption around it. That's what I understand. But my goal is to get my grandson back. He's not feeling well. He's dehydrated. He's developed bumps on his back. The woman, I'm not even going to call her a foster parent because she's not a parent. Parents don't do this to their kids, okay? They just don't enable this kind of stuff to happen. So the woman that's currently taking care of him, right, said to my daughter yesterday, oh, well, he potty trained. He went and, and I'm like, my daughter said, okay, so he was doing that before he left the house. And he was. So it's no news to us. If anything, he's 2 weeks behind. And he's very sad. Extremely sad. So I don't know who takes pleasure in bringing sadness to children. He was loved by a lot of people in this house. They say patience is a virtue, right? But this patience, my dad doesn't have that many years left to live. And, he worked hard. He was a janitor, right, for the parliament. And he worked very hard his whole life. And he knows the disparities in between the unions and the private sector and all this other stuff. And he has a good grasp of politics. And, as of late, in the last 10 years, he basically called the BC Legislative Assembly's, kangaroo court because, they were ramming home legislation and, union busting and, and kicking out single mothers with children out in the streets like me in 2003, with ultimatums. And obviously they've been going around, snatching up babies here, left, right, and center. And, people are just like rolling over and taking it. My grandson will, even if they adopted him out, even if they could, and they did, at some point, he's going to grow up and he's going to ask why. And he's going to want to know the truth. And they're going to have to tell him. And then he's going to find his way back to his real family. And then there's going to be consequences around that. Because he has a right to stand up for himself and say, why? Why did you do that to me? And if they stick him in with some family where there's mental illness worse than what's in my house, in terms of bulimia, anorexia, depression, clinical depression, suicidal tendencies, to the point where you end up in mental institutions, in and out, and, drugged on prescription pills to the point where, you're left with tubes at the end of your last breath, because that's what those drugs did to your body, on top of starving yourself. If he ends up in a home like that, well, there's going to be more consequences, isn't there? So as these people are planning his future, even though they have no right to plan his future, they need to stop and really look in the mirror and see themselves for what they are, versus trying to suggest what I am or the rest of my family is. Andre belongs with his family. We miss him. We love him. We want him back. We're worried for him. And we are feeling as sick as he's feeling sick. And that's fact.